What is the future of energy? As we ponder the big questions facing our world today, where will future populations be generating their power? How will we meet the energetic needs of AI? What are the future connections in a growingly fractured world between security, geopolitics, and energy? To understand where we may go in the future, we need to understand where we have been and where we are today. I'm Joseph Majkut. I'm the director of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program here at CSIS, and I'm very glad that you all are joining us for this digital presentation of the 2025 Statistical Review of World Energy, with a conversation to follow. We've assembled a group of experts to talk about the report, the status of the energy world today, and help us separate signal from noise in the energy statistics of the moment and the big trends that we are seeing and will continue to see emerge in a complicated and varied world. We'll begin today's program with a brief presentation of this newest report from Energy Institute CEO Nick Wayth, followed by a conversation with Angie, Gildea, and Dan Yergin and myself. And we will be accepting over the course of the program questions from our viewing audience, both using the box available to you on the streaming platform, as well as on X and other social media. I look forward to today's conversation, and I'm grateful that you've joined us all. Maybe I can begin by introducing Nick Wayth, CEO of the Energy Institute. The Energy Institute has become the keeper of the Statistical Review of World Energy, one of the most essential documents for energy scholars the world over. They do the hard work of organizing energy statistics from countries around the world and putting them into a globally harmonized picture of our energy system. Where do we get our energy? Where is it used? How is it traded? And what are the implications of the trends that we see? Nick's got some slides to share with us, and then we can move to a conversation. Nick, thank you for joining us here at CSIS. You're beaming in from London. Welcome today.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you. And thank you to CSIS for hosting this today. Really good to be back for a second year. And good afternoon, everyone. Good to have you watching today. So, my name is Nick Wayth. I'm the Chief Exec of the Energy Institute. We're a UK-based but global professional membership body for people working in energy right across the world. And as you pointed out, we do look after the Statistical Review of World Energy. This is the 74th edition. The first 71 editions, as many of your audience will know, were compiled by BP. And we don't do it alone. We're delighted to have the support of KPMG, Carney, and indeed S&P Global, as well as Heriot-Watt University, who all provide help behind the scenes for us. So I won't dwell on the intro too long, but I just wanted to really fly through some of the headlines from this year's numbers. So I'll get straight into the numbers. I'm not really going to do the story justice, but what I want to do is maximize the time for conversation. So starting with the headlines from 2024, first of all, total energy demand grew by 2% last year, largely driven by non-OECD, which grew at about 2.5% versus OECD, which grew at only 0.5%. Oil remains the single largest source of energy, so accounting for about 34% of total demand, and for the first time in how we measure it, exceeding 101 million barrels a day of demand. Coal also hit a new record in terms of demand, with 83% of consumption now centered in Asia Pacific, and notably China and India. And natural gas had a strong pickup after a couple of years of pretty sort of flat growth, growing by 2.5%. So in short, fossil is not yet growing. I know Dan will talk more about this, but we are still in a world of an energy addition rather than substitution. But what I think is notable is just the rate at which renewables grew again, wind and solar growing 16% in 2024. And so a pretty significant growth rate, and I'll talk more about the regional dynamics. So that's the global demand picture. Let me just turn briefly to the US, and in a bit more focus, I think what's really interesting, I mean, although overall demand increased in the US very slightly by 0.5%, I think what's noticeable on this chart on the left is just how much coal has continued to be squeezed by both gas and renewables, really sort of displacing coal. And coal fell in 2024 to its lowest level of production and demand in the US in many decades. We can come back to the US and we can come back to any of these charts. I want to just turn to energy production and building on that point of an energy addition. In 2024, every single major form of energy reached an all-time high: record oil, record coal, record gas, record renewables, record nuclear, and record hydro. And whilst that may not sound too surprising, actually that hasn't happened for nearly 2 decades. I think the last time all of those stars aligned was 2006. In terms of sort of some of the highlights of production, coal production being led by India and Indonesia, growing 7% and 8% respectively. Oil, and I know your audience, Joseph, will understand this much better than me, but notably US oil production, I've got a chart, we'll show this in a minute, reached the combined levels of Saudi and Russia combined. One point that's worth noting is Chinese oil production has continued to grow. Admittedly, China is still a large importer, but actually over the last 5 years, Chinese oil production has grown by 10%. And in terms of gas, the US, Russia, Iran, and China together accounted for over half of global production. Russian production grew by 7% last year, with exports increasing to both China and Europe. And global LNG, actually a bit of a flat year for LNG demand, down 1%. And as many of you know, the US remained for the second consecutive year the largest exporter of LNG. I already talked about sort of the percentage growth in renewables, but in production terms, solar grew by 28%, adding 455 terawatt hours, which is sort of 2.5 times higher, the next largest contributor to the grid in 24. In fact, solar alone added 50% more than coal and gas additions onto the grid. And hydro, despite some falls in the Americas, had its biggest annual output increase since 2010, which is the year that China's Three Gorges Dam came online. And then lastly, briefly, nuclear, maybe turning a corner. We may want to talk about nuclear some more, rising 3% to reach 9% of global electricity generation. However, I would note that most of that growth was actually return of existing capacity in France and Japan rather than new capacity coming back on. And this still falls short of the tripling of nuclear by 2050, which would have to grow more like 4% rather than the sort of just under 3% that it did. I'll just very quickly, we've just done a US chart. I mean, I just think the oil production story, which you all know well, is stark. And adding all these up, the US is accountable for about 1/6 of global energy production. You can see on the right-hand chart, on the right-hand side, coal reaching that sort of 40-plus year low, but oil, and be interesting, maybe one of the things we'll discuss is whether 2024 was a high watermark for US crude production.
Nick, I think one thing you should explain, the oil number used for the US is not only crude oil, which is, that 13.5 billion, but it includes liquids.
Yeah, we include natural gas, liquids, and condensate, so it's an all-in number. That's right, Dan.
Yeah.
Just briefly on emissions, unsurprisingly, with fossil up 1%, emissions also grew by around 1%, reaching an all-time high of 41 gigatons. Emissions continue to fall in the US and in Europe. Europe's now 16% below 2014 levels. And just one thing to flag is methane emissions continue to rise broadly and flaring broadly in line with the production of fossil. I think one thing worth calling out, and we'll talk more about China, is just the rate of the sort of reduction in intensity of Chinese energy. There's lots of absolute additions, but in a relative sort of CO2 emissions per gigajoule, China has fallen faster than any other major economy. So all of this put together, we've sort of framed this as a disorderly transition, and I'll just give a few sort of geographic highlights. And I think, if there is one country sort of defining the energy transition right now, it is China. China added more than 2.5 times the renewable generation of the US, Europe, and India combined, more than the rest of the world put together, and was responsible for over 60% of global solar and wind additions in 24. And yet, at the same time, it remains the largest emitter. Emissions rose in China last year, driven by increased gas and coal. And of course, the Chinese grid still is 60% dependent on coal generation. So China's the sort of massive paradox. On the one hand, it's the biggest driver of clean energy, but it remains the largest single source and still growing for now, at least, in terms of emissions. In the US, I already alluded to that sort of squeeze of coal being squashed between gas and coal. Solar had a really strong year in the US last year. Generation increased 27% in 1 year. So we want to explore more about the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act. And wind also had a bounce back. Wind actually fell in terms of generation in 23. So 24 saw a bounce back. Europe, similar pattern of coal and increasing renewables. And then India, sort of different from the rest of the world, where fossil still dominates the growth of energy. And although solar continued to grow at a pretty healthy 17%, it's such a small starting point that it barely registers on the chart. And I think a real sobering fact is that even if India meets its really ambitious renewable targets, it will need to continue growing coal out to 2050. Very briefly, Africa, 1.5 billion people who have the least access to energy. And again, it was flat last year. It grew slightly by 1% overall energy demand in 24. Perhaps more positively, electrification accelerated. I'll talk more about that globally, but in Africa, it grew by 4%. But it's really notable. And you can see on the right-hand chart that whilst India begins to pull up in terms of energy consumption per capita, Africa is effectively flat. Couple of other things to highlight on that chart. For the second consecutive year, China remains ahead of Europe, so it's getting more energy intense per capita. Now, of course, it is the world's manufacturing center, but notable that it's continuing to pull away from Europe in terms of per capita energy use. And the other point I'll just make is globally, energy demand per capita is still increasing. So whilst Europe and the US continue sort of an ongoing downward trajectory, it is notable that global energy demand per capita continues. Conscious I'm going through these at pace, so we can come back to any of these. I think one of the really big sort of stories this year is that Chinese oil demand fell. It fell by about 1% in 24. So whilst overall oil demand globally increased, China did fall. This is a backward-looking report, so we're not providing a forecast. So we'll have to wait and see whether 23 was a peak of Chinese oil demand. I know there are forecasts out there that show 25 sort of picking up and potentially overtaking 23. But I think that's a really, really significant one to watch. And then the other thing I'll just highlight on this chart is that sort of global gasoline and diesel sort of stagnating. Gasoline grew slightly, diesel stagnating. And some of that is being driven by China, but also just sort of, continual efficiency improvements in the vehicle fleet. And of course, electric vehicles beginning in some markets to have some impact. And one notable thing is just the amount of gas going into trucking. I think there's 1 million trucks in China, which is reducing diesel demand. So I'll just sort of bring the final theme together, which is around sort of electrification, and it was a strong year for electrification, 4% growth globally. So electrification continues to grow at roughly 2x the overall rate of energy demand. And I think it's sort of, it's certainly, true that this sort of demand for electricity is growing. Of course, data centers and AI are a part of that, but I think what perhaps is driving more of this is just the demand for cooling. And actually, whilst we should focus on the sort of regional impacts of demand for data centers and AI, I think global cooling in India, in Africa, And in parts of Europe, I mean, the number of sort of the focus we've had in recent weeks here in the UK on air conditioning is going to be a continuing theme of energy demand. And then I think, you know, when I talk about this disorderly transition, I think what's really stark is not only the absolute differences between grids, but actually grids that sort of are diverging away from each other globally as you look at some of the big markets. Once again, you know, China is at the heart of the transition. I mean, China, the scale of China's grid now, it has effectively added a US grid over the last decade. It's adding two UK grids a year. So it is just phenomenal, the terms, you know, the scale of that growth, but also the renewable penetration and the renewable contribution to that growth. So in 2023, coal contributed over half of the additional generation, just over half, I think it was 56%, with renewables and hydro making up the balance of the year-on-year growth. In 2024, coal added just 10% of incremental electricity demand, with renewables and hydro accounting for 80 or so percent, nuclear making up some of the difference, and gas 4%. So we've got a situation where, despite the massive dependency on coal, actually we are approaching an inflection point where low carbon forms of energy may make up all of the incremental growth this year or next year, or at some point very soon, on the Chinese grid, which I think is really significant. I already mentioned India, but you can see that stark just dependency on coal really making up all the growth, as I alluded to. So I think, you know, I'm going to sort of pause there in terms of the slides, other than just to kind of draw it to a conclusion and say, look, 2024, you know, all forms of energy reached record high, peak everything. This age of electrification playing out, significant growth in electricity demand growth, underpinned globally by renewables, but with very stark differences between key economies. You know, we'll talk more about global demand for oil growth, certainly a slowing of global oil growth driven by that decline in Chinese demand. And of course, China has made up over half of global demand over the last decade, over the last 2 decades, pick whatever time period you want. But China has driven that global demand, and that has now gone in a different direction. And I think this overarching theme of sort of diverging regional differences contributing to an increasingly disorderly transition. So, Joseph, I will pause there and hand the floor back to you.
Nick,
and I should say, all of the data is available to download. There's a QR code, so it's all freely available. But I'll stop sharing there if you want me to.
Nick, yeah, go ahead and we can return to video, and so our guests can see your smiling face. You help me understand more the billing that you've created here, the sort of disorderly transition, the high regionalization you see in the data. Transition to where? Let me ask the moderator's prerogative. Let me ask where, the data shows us just the absolute dominance of China in change in the energy system, even though global energy is much larger than just China. Help me understand, like, where, this sense of disorder and where you see the statistics are showing us real transition versus a world of addition.
Yeah, so I think, I'll come back to China. We can talk about other markets as well. But I think, this isn't a surprise to any of us. I think it's been clear that China strategically has been playing a very long-term game on the transition, not because it wants to lead necessarily on climate change or any other dimension, but strategically in terms of energy security and strategically in terms of creating, meaningful businesses around EVs, around renewables, and that's exactly what it's doing. I mean, it is. I know your audience is in the US. I'm in the UK. China in 1 year added just the year-on-year change was double in solar, was double all of the solar. I know I'm not in a sunny country, it's sunny right now, but it's double all of the historic UK solar production in all of history. I just think most of us in the Western world are not familiar with the pace that China is operating at. And I think if you just look at sort of, the import dependency, China is still massively dependent on imports, but actually the investments it's made in terms of growing its oil production, in terms of renewables, over the last 5 years is equivalent to a year's worth of European energy supply. So this is a strategic move, and I think we're going to see some big inflection points for China. If oil didn't peak in 23, it's not far off it. And the question is then, does it have a slow decline, or does it come down, a pretty sharp decline? We can debate that. There are different forecasts out there. So I think, that to me is a clear transition driven by security and everything I've just talked about. And I think structurally, Europe and the US are going in similar paths around renewables dominating the grid. So and then contrast that to India, and Africa isn't even growing at all. So I think you've just got different parts of the world operating all within, for good reason for their own economies and for their populations in very different ways.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for. I know that compiling this information is a huge amount of work, but it is such a valuable resource for energy scholars, for analysts, both so you can kind of track changes in time, but also you can get a realistic picture of what the global energy system is doing, without the sort of political spin or the ideological priors that all of us bring to these kinds of conversations, right? The cold hard facts are an incredibly useful thing for us to look at. Now, in this context, in a second, I want to turn to Angie and Dan and bring them into the conversation more fully. But Nick, I do want to ask you one last question, just to satisfy my own curiosity. Was there anything this year that surprised you? So you're looking back at 2024. We're measuring what are in effect huge changes, but they're small in percentage terms. But what did anything jump out at you that you looked at the final report and you said, wait, how could that be? What deserves explanation?
So I think, I don't know, I mean, Dan will talk more about the piece he wrote in Foreign Affairs, which, this notion of energy addition. So part of me thought we might not quite see everything growing at the rate it did. So there was part of me that may have naively been thinking we might hit some more inflection points, and that clearly hasn't happened at the global level. But I think, I thought it was, on the one hand, mathematically you would say, well, every few years, everything ought to, in a growing world where everything's growing, everything should would naturally hit that all-time record, actually, because of the fluctuations of gas and COVID and then nuclear and hydro. The fact that every major form of energy hit an all-time high, and that hasn't happened for 2 decades, I think is noteworthy. And then, I think just the pace of China just continues. When you talk about it in exajoules and terawatt hours, nobody can really get a feel for what those terawatt hours feel like. When you put it in the scale of a US grid added in a decade, you think, wow, this is a country that is growing fast and doing things differently to virtually anywhere else on the planet.
Great, thank you. Well, Dan Yergin joins us as well. Dan is the vice chairman of S&P Global and a legendary energy historian and analyst. Dan, you've been invoked, so I'd like to turn to you and see both. You did publish a piece earlier this year, just before the CERAWeek conference, on living in life in a world of energy addition. You're a keen observer of the energy system. I know you've read the report. What kind of highlights are you thinking about, and how do they relate to the work that you've done?
First, Joe, it's great that CSIS is hosting this again. And for those who don't know the statistical review, it really is the baseload for understanding the energy world. And its importance transcends, I think, any other single data source. And so it really gives a perspective that you don't have anywhere else. And it has a great advantage. It's free. It's a huge service that is presented for the world community. So a couple of reactions. One, as we're talking about the scale of China, which is, the other thing I want to say, great credit to KPMG and to Carney for their support of this and helping to make it happen. And so, because it really is a huge service to the global community. I was thinking as Nick was talking, the scale of China is, China, looking through the report myself last night and over the weekend, China's 75% more energy than the United States, 4 times greater than commercial energy in India. It really highlights it. And in terms of emissions, and I was thinking, why should England bother to do anything about emissions? Because its emissions are only 3% of China's and really won't have any impact. It's obviously what happens in China. The second thing is, I guess I would, separate myself or disagree with the use of the disorderly, because it suggests that somehow somebody knows what an orderly energy transition would be. And if you ask people in Southeast Asia, as we recently did at our Energy Asia conference, they don't want to be told how an energy transition should be organized by people in Northwest Europe. So that's why I think Atul Arya and Peter Orzag, our co-author, preferred multidimensional energy transition, unfolding in different regions, different paces, different mixes of technology, different priorities in terms of economic growth and so forth. And then the third thing that I wanted to say is that one thing that jumps out, we typically, if we'd used last year's statistical review, would have said fossil fuels are about 80% of world energy. Despite all those, all the changes, in the new way it's formulated, it's actually 87% of the energy mix. And I think understanding why that 87%, even with all the advances in renewables and wind, 87% is still a very big number. So maybe we'll get some more discussion. And as to why without getting too nitty gritty, why the computation changed, because I think that's actually one of the shocking things to come out of this year's report. Or surprise.
Why don't we go right there? And in fact, we've had a question about that same issue, the same finding on X, maybe to Nick or to Angie. Angie is the U.S. head for energy at KPMG, the group that does a lot of the statistical analysis underlying this. Nick or Angie, feel free to jump in as well. Help us understand. Just baseline, the problem is, how do you compare the energy input from a barrel of oil, a short ton of coal, or
another way to do it, Joe, is why was last year it was 80% or 81%, and this year it's 87%.
Right. Yeah. What happened?
But don't confuse people. Don't make it too complicated.
Okay, I'm going to try and explain this in the simplest terms possible. I think so. Firstly, the methodology we used was developed by BP many years ago, and it sort of made sense when renewables were operating at very, very low percent, 1%, 2% globally. It really didn't make a difference. And effectively, the methodology that we used to have grossed up renewables as if they were being generated by a CCGT. So you would measure your renewables, and this is a simplification, as if you were, so for each gigajoule of renewables, you'd say, well, I'd need sort of 2.5 gigajoules of gas to make that same level of electricity because of the efficiencies or inefficiencies of a CCGT. Now, that on the one hand kind of gave renewables a sort of a fair shot in terms of comparisons, but what it's done is it's meant that we've exaggerated the overall energy demand, because we've been grossing up not just renewables but hydro and nuclear. And so one thing you'll notice is last year we reported 620 exajoules. This year it's 582. We've grown energy, but what we've taken off is that sort of loss of energy. Now, I'm in danger, Joseph, you're looking confused, so I won't go into too much detail. The reason we've done this is to align with others, such as the IEA, so we present it on a consistent basis. But also what we're being very transparent about is what is the equivalent of those avoided fossil conversion losses. And so in the very first chart I showed you, the sharp viewers may have spotted there was a dotted line on top. That is effectively the avoided conversion losses of the system. I think the other thing that's worth noting is we're talking about supply, and I got into a bit of a debate on LinkedIn with others a few days ago who obviously thought this was some great conspiracy, which it absolutely isn't. But I think it's also important to focus on the end use and the useful energy. And one of the things we'll try and develop through time is a better sort of illustration of how much of that energy actually goes into useful service in terms of all that energy use.
So just because I do have to achieve clarity
Okay.
myself, if no one else, you've got energy coming into the system from a variety of sources. To make a direct comparison, you want to be able to look at the heat loss in a turbine or an engine, which is not something you see in an electricity system, though they have their losses as well. And in sort of calibrating the relative losses of primary energy to the end user, you have to sort of, you do that calibration in a different way. And this year you find the world using less energy.
The world fossil, yeah, the world is using fossil, despite, right. Dan's the number last year was 81, it's gone to 87. That's a function of the methodology rather than us using more fossil. So fossil as a percentage of the mix did decline in 2024.
But you're having to discount loss, you're discounting losses that were previously assumed by this methodology for hydro and other things.
Well, we're not, which is the difference. So best go on the website. Otherwise, we're going to lose people, I think, on this, Joseph. But I think we're now in line with others. And when you look at it on the website, there's a simple sort of diagram that sets out what those changes are.
And has the fundamental... Go ahead, Angie.
I was going to say, I think it's fair to say, Nick, that this was really a conversion factor question. And over time, the statistical reviews numbers were continuing to diverge from other sources. We knew we had to bite the bullet at some point over the years, and this was the year we did that just to make it more in line with other calculations. But it's really a conversion.
Yeah, and any of us would be comfortable with that. Does the big qualitative picture change? Or in what ways does the qualitative picture change from having made this change?
Well, let's go to Angie for that. No, let's go to Angie for that question.
Well, I don't think the picture necessarily changes from the sense that the world is still hungry for energy. We're still continuing to add sources at record demand. So fossil fuels is still very much in the mix as it was before. What's interesting that we're seeing is the addition with energies, the renewables continue to increase and add to the overall mix versus necessarily displacing in some areas.
And I think two things, following from what Angie says, two things to watch from this one, which already Nick has highlighted, is Chinese oil demand. Did it peak last year? Or is it only transportation fuel? Is it peak this year, next year? So that's one thing to watch. The other thing that I thought, obviously Nick highlighted the 4% growth in electricity, but noted that the 10-year average was 2.5%. So that was very notable. And then the fact that oil is 34%, I think Nick said, and gas is 25%, but gas is growing, as Nick said, this year, 2.5%. Will it continue to grow at that rate? Or was that a one-time sort of aberration? So I think those are kind of the sort of the open questions that this wonderful compendium raises for thinking about the future.
Well, Dan, maybe I'd love to hear your thoughts a little bit more on that question of thinking about the future, because the challenge, right, is identifying signal to noise. This is a year-to-year database. And so, 1 year of poor hydro resources in the American West or in Brazil, continued recovery from the shock of the gas crisis following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in Europe. These things can offset, they can cause pretty big shifts for a year or two or three. How do you think about separating signal from noise when you look at data like this?
Well, I guess it is really looking, the wonderful thing is you have this data that goes back several years, and then if you go in the database, it has what no one else has. It goes back to 1965. So you can one of the things I did is look, oil overtook coal as the world's number one energy source in the mid-60s. But then you look at the database and you say the world is using more coal now, 3 times as much coal as it did in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. So you can see those trend things. I think the trends around China, what Nick has talked about in terms of renewables, in terms of demand, its scale, those, those trends are pretty clear, and it's just a question of what year, what happens. I think we certainly have the sense that gas is, several years ago, the IEA said gas was having its golden age, and then it sort of, the message was actually that golden age was pretty tarnished, but now we're seeing, gas coming back quite strongly. And I think we'll see maybe more of the impact of the electrification and the impact of the electricity demand for AI showing up. And that's something that we will be able to track with this.
It's just on that, if I may, Dan. I mean, yeah, although renewables had a really strong year in the US, and if you look at sort of the big moving blocks on incremental demand, gas was also up sharply in US generation. And it's noteworthy that 40% of US energy comes from gas. So, when you think about these transitions, gas is now the most dominant form of energy in the US.
Well, we've got a lot of it. Dan, how do you think about that gas question from a US perspective with respect to growing domestic demand, particularly AI? 80% of accelerated AI chips are being deployed in the US over the next few years, if you believe the contracting numbers. And so a lot of the AI demand signal for power is going to be a US story, at least for the next few years. That has big implications for domestic gas demand. At the same time, we're going to roughly double our LNG export capacity over that period as facilities come online, which are presently under construction. How do you think about the next few years in that context, and how does that fit into this global picture?
Well, I think that number that Nick said, that 1/6 of all world energy is generated in the United States, I found that kind of ties into the current language around the role of energy.
Is that energy dominance?
Well, certainly sounds like energy, big player. And I think from what we understand, the U.S. has very ample gas resources, but this is really a resurgence for gas because of both LNG. There will be competitors for LNG. And then I think the last, if you go back 2 years ago and looked at the providers of energy conversion technologies, wind and so forth, that's where they were focused. Now they're focused on gas turbines. Will we reach a point where maybe Angie will have a view of this, that will these chips become so much more efficient that they won't be driving electricity demand in the way that we have seen it now? But it's now a lot of the question, traditionally you worry about energy security in terms of oil and gas, but now it's reliability in terms of electricity, at least in the US, and maybe now in Spain and Portugal, what's happened there.
Not just reliability, but I would say availability.
Yeah.
The challenge for the US is can we build it fast enough to meet what we believe the growing demand will be? Or can we manage the grid effectively?
Yeah.
And I think that's really important for folks to recognize, is that there's 3 legs to the stool. There's an affordability aspect, there's a reliability, and then there's a sustainability aspect to this. And so I agree with Dan. We don't necessarily see it as a disorderly transition, more like a mosaic of different transitions. And you see different priorities getting expressed in different regions. So, the story that I think is going to be interesting to look out for in the future as we continue to move towards with this growth around data centers is how, I believe natural gas will continue from particularly permitted, et cetera. So that'll be
for now it's we heard at CERAWeek this year that we're going to have fusion, 400 megawatts of fusion in Virginia by 2032.
Well, if you look
met
at
Bob Mumgarden, I wouldn't bet against him, Dan. I might bet on the date. But I wouldn't bet against it happening.
Well,
I need to correct myself, by the way. I said 40%. US is 35% overall gas, but on the grid it's 43% gas. So I mean, it's hugely dominant.
That's an energy statistics faux pas, Nick. Drinks are on you the next time we're all together in person.
And I think that kind of recognition, that's one of the things the statistical review, it reveals things that are just not in the conventional wisdom. If you ask people about that, they would have no idea that it was anywhere near close to that.
So, Angie, maybe we can turn to you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this year's report. Any surprising factors from you? We've heard from Nick and Dan on that front. And just generally, what is your read on whether it's the U.S. or the global picture?
Yeah, one of the things a couple of points that just stuck out to me. One is Nick and Dan have already mentioned this, but the China story, and particularly around their pace in renewables. And when you overlay that with their EV demand versus ICE vehicles and the journey that they're on, I think that is just a fascinating story there. I also found it interesting on the solar and renewable growth in the U.S. And as you compare that with some of the government policies and incentives we had around the IRA, I thought that was interesting. And now we'll see, if that trend continues or how that changes. And then the last point was, was disheartening to me to see Africa still at such a low level of energy consumption per capita. Last year, we saw, I believe, how the Russia-Ukraine situation with the gas, how the gas markets flowed, that, Africa really lost out. And it was because of an affordability standpoint. But we continue to still see Africa at such a low energy consumption. And we know that energy prosperity equals economic prosperity. So I'm curious to get Nick and Dan's take on that one. I wish we
well, I think it'll be very interesting to see what organizations like the World Bank do to shift their policies to promote broader energy development and not just in a very, in one area. Because as you say, Angie, if you don't have economic growth there, it will make the current migration levels seem small, particularly going into Europe, compared to what they'll be in the future, given that Africa will have, 25% of world population.
We have an energy secretary here in the United States, which is emphasizing, who emphasizes energy poverty over energy transition. I think looking at graphs like what Nick has. Nick, what are your thoughts on this front, and how is this kind of cold reality being interpreted by your audience?
Yeah, well, I think Angie's spot on to highlight that, and I think there's a couple of elements to it. I think there's clearly there is a cost of capital, and I think the multilateral development banks have failed to sort of bring crowd in other forms of capital. I know that there's it's difficult doing business, and of course when you say Africa, you shouldn't simplify it as Africa. It is north of 50 separate countries, each of whom have their own policies and challenges and opportunities. But I think, the scale of population, I heard a statistic, I haven't fact checked it, but by 2050, something like 1 in 10 people born on the planet will be in Nigeria, one single country in Africa. That gives you a sense of the growth rate of population in Africa. And I think the other dimension is, and Angie, you mentioned about just the displacement of gas. Yes, gas markets did rebalance after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but that came at a huge financial cost to Europe, but it came at a huge absence of energy in Africa cost, and a carbon cost in economies like Indonesia, China, India, which reverted back to coal. So I think this interdependency, and I completely agree, Dan. It is multidimensional and multifaceted. I think the point we made about this disorderly transition is one that I think people sort of seem to think there's sort of a linear path and everything can be set out in a very sort of spreadsheet kind of type manner.
And a graph that goes, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, with all the connectivity between different parts of the world demonstrates just, how much, one influences the other.
Well, so Nick, you made a point earlier in the conversation about the enormous changes and the energy diversification ongoing in China as being driven not out of climate concern, but out of security concerns. Dan, you literally wrote several books about energy security in various ages. Do you buy that explanation?
Oh, I think, when I'm there and I talk to Chinese, they talk about climate. But I think they import 75% of their oil. It comes through much of it comes through the South China Sea. They know the history of World War II disruption, the Strait of Malacca. So I think I think that security factor, they see that as a form of vulnerability, particularly with rising tensions. And secondly, thirdly, the other thing is the competitive advantage. They were never going to overtake the world automobile market in terms of internal combustion engines, but they're poised to do that in terms of EVs. And that strategy is looks like it's going to pay off for them and speaking of disorder, it's going to create a lot of disorder and disruption for automobile companies in other parts of the world, and particularly in Europe.
Yeah.
So I think it's a combination of global economic competitive strategy, energy security strategy / geopolitical, and climate and environment. And there's also the dirty air in the cities.
Right. I was going to mention that as well.
Angie, what are your thoughts on that, particularly as it relates to what corporate firms are thinking about doing when they're sort of setting strategies around energy resilience, price, carbon? How do these different factors influence their decision making, and can we see any of that in this data as well?
Well, I think it's understanding what's going on globally definitely influences strategies, particularly the big companies. One thing that we do see, and a good example would be the overall emissions. Now we've seen emissions tick up for sure, but there's also been a lot of work done to reduce emissions. In the U.S., we have seen where for the second consecutive year, we are below emissions. We're now about below emissions at 2023 levels, despite increasing production. So we've seen companies make concerted efforts around that. In Europe, we're below emissions than we were a decade ago. So you're certainly seeing some of the IOCs and companies focused around that. Dan and I are both members of the National Petroleum Council. The council did a study to the previous energy secretary, and then there was broad agreement around there's work to be done over continuing to focus on emissions. So I see companies still focused on that as well.
I want to talk a little bit more about emissions because from a climate perspective, one might read this report and be disheartened. Growth everywhere, including in coal. 5 years ago, it felt like climate was the principal objective of energy system planning. And I'm not sure that you look at these results and find that to be the case. Dan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And then Nick, if I could ask you after Dan's finished to call up the slides again. There's a chart in there that I'd love to briefly discuss before we close today's conversation. But Dan, your thoughts on this sort of where does climate fit in the rank?
Well, I think Angie said affordability, availability, that if you're an emerging market country, you have different priorities, and different resources to use. So I think it's quite true that during COVID, when demand collapsed and price collapsed, it was a sole focus on this. But then I think the experience of the last couple of years is what's led to just saying, whether you want to say it's disorderly, multidimensional, just more complicated, it's going to take longer. It's not going to happen quickly. And you have some real counter forces there, such as AI and geopolitical factors. I think the return of energy security, which had fallen off the table, is a big factor. So I think it's that there are multiple objectives at the same time. And to some degree, those objectives clash.
Right. Nick, could you please pull up the slides? There's one on there. You had a slide of emissions intensity of energy use that I'd love to briefly discuss.
Let me just get to that chart. Joseph, before we go there, just very briefly, this bit of the chart here that you can see, the dotted bit, that's the avoided conversion losses that have come from fossil, not using fossil effectively, and so that's the difference between the 87% and the 81%. Is whether that is your denominator or that's your denominator. Let me go to the chart.
Just before while you do that, one other question. You said 101 million barrels a day for oil demand. Other people use, doesn't the IA 106, something like that?
Yeah, we strip out biofuels, and there's a few other little nuances.
Oh, right.
Yeah, because biofuels, most people don't count as crude, but I think they may include that. There's a few other differences as well in how we treat biomass. Let me get that emissions chart, Joseph. Here you go.
So this isn't that, particularly the chart on the right is very interesting to me because I've got a picture here in the U.S. thinking about China, and policymakers here in the U.S. think about China as, in the grand scheme of things, cheap energy, freely emitting, building lots of coal. And so a lot of the bigger economic story that has made China the manufacturing power of the world has an underlying energy current to it. And there's a lot of talk here in Washington about using carbon border adjustments and carbon tariffs as one way of addressing that challenge. But I look at this chart and I see that carbon intensity of energy use in China is falling faster than almost anywhere, including the United States. How am I reading this correctly? And what are the implications of that?
Joseph, I mean, you're reading the chart correctly. I am always very skeptical of any index chart that I see anywhere. And so if I was to sort of criticize myself, of course, in an index chart, it all depends on where your starting point is and what the absolutes are. And so, I think if you were to plot the same thing on sort of absolutes, you would see, a different picture. I mean, China's still sort of going down, but the absolutes would be very different between a Europe and a US and a China. So,
I see.
But this is the paradox of the transition, isn't it? I think there are so many sort of, different aspects of each data point, and how you plot the charts really does matter.
Well, it's not even that. It's just the age we're in, right? We have a diversifying but still growing energy system. And so how you set your baseline, how you set your comparison, how you avoid heat conversion losses, all become essential to the stories we tell ourselves, no?
Yeah, exactly.
But let me think about this question here of falling carbon intensity. If it's been remarkably hard to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on a per ton basis globally, and though the U.S. has had a lot of success, it seems that the AI demand signal and further electrification probably are going to stall that success for the time being. When we think about metrics of the transition, and by the transition, I think we all colloquially mean moving toward low carbon energy system, do we need to pay more attention to the big trends in emissions intensity and less to the tonnage itself? Question to the group.
Well, it's probably both. It's both. But what you're saying is that there is a really important signal here. And you're right. I mean, some people might be surprised to know, isn't there legislation now for the U.S. to have a carbon border adjustment mechanism aimed at China?
Yeah, we have. There are 2 or 3 kind of models floating around Capitol Hill. It's something the administration has expressed some interest in. I think it's one of the next big public policy debates we'll have in Washington relating to climate and energy and trade. And I'm just sort of, I think this chart is very interesting, even regardless of the baselining issue that Nick raised. I think this carbon intensity question is fascinating.
Dan's right. I mean, it has to be both. I mean, ultimately, if you follow the science of climate change, it doesn't. The science doesn't care where the emissions come from when it comes to CO2. So absolute is ultimately what matters for planet Earth. But I think, I mean, to sort of challenge, to take apart this chart a little bit. I mean, if you did it in absolute, the US has a lower CO2 emissions intensity than China. It's significantly lower. So the US is still, per unit of energy, much more efficient than China. It's just that China's been on a very rapidly declining curve.
And Angie, any thoughts here?
Well, and it also, I think, highlights the previous graph Nick showed that shows the growth in renewables. If you just look at that country picture of China, renewables looks like it's growing, but it looks like, on the graph to the naked eye, it's growing at a very thin level. But when you actually see just total how much renewables that they have contributed to, I think that's driving a lot of that growth down from an emission standpoint.
So generally speaking, do we expect a world of energy addition to be a world of falling carbon intensity of economic production?
Well, we certainly haven't seen that to date, right? We've seen as we continue to grow energy, the absolute value of emissions has continued to grow. So I think you've got, short of the fact that we're going to stall our total energy growth, I think that, and that then impacts our total economic growth, right? I think it's a complex problem. I think you have to look at both.
And I just jump. I think so. I mean, that's happened in the US. Energy demand has increased and emissions have fallen. In the US, energy demand has fallen, emissions have fallen faster. So it is happening. It's happening. But
the country in the world with the fastest addition of energy consumption is also falling over the last 10 years, fastest in its carbon intensity, no?
Yeah, but growing absolute. So I think, the tipping points are going to be when the Chinese grid starts displacing fossil. That's a major tipping point. I think if that crude demand was a peak in 23, whether it's 23, 25 or, 26, Chinese peak demand will, we will see, my assertion is we will see peak Chinese emissions this decade.
Dan, any final words?
Well, I think you've raised a really good question for some thought, for something that might be one of the themes next year for the statistical review to focus in on that. And I think that you're raising that question actually brings some clarification to the policy debates and the political debates that hasn't been there now. So I think that, I'm really glad you called attention to that graphic. And I think it behooves us to think about the implications. That's a very, that's part of the virtue of this statistical review, that it opens up our mind to thinking differently about basic energy questions.
I believe I can sign off on that. Thank you all so much for joining us. Dan, Angie, we really appreciate your comments here today. Nick, we're all here because of your hard work and the hard work of your colleagues.
It's many people, and actually just another thank you to KPMG, but also Dan. Dan sort of quietly helps us in the background, sitting on our advisory board, and has been a great source of wisdom for us. So I am grateful for everybody that supports it and makes it better. I'm sure many of the audience online are participating in some shape or form.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone who's joined us today, the viewing audience. This is one of the things I look forward to annually, and we appreciate that you gave us so much of your time today. To my panelists, thank you. To colleagues joining online, please do stay tuned for our next event here at CSIS, and God willing, we will see you all next July for another discussion of the signals, the noise, as it relates to energy in our world, and maybe a prolonged discussion of carbon intensity of production.
Right.
Joseph Majkut signing off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.